Welcome back. I am John P. Today we are going to be covering the ultimate watch brand tier list. I am asked this question in so many different ways, especially on my Instagram, The Real John P, where you can see a little bit more about me and what goes on behind the scenes at delraywatch.com, where we buy, sell, and trade watches. But I'm asked about watch tiers, watch quality. Is this watch brand or model better than this other watch brand or model XYZ? So what I'm going to be doing here today is giving you the actual watch brand tier list. Now I say actual, really more in terms of what I believe them to be. Now before I had Del Rey Watch and have handled thousands of watches from all of these brands, I also was a avid and diehard watch collector, and I would go through my personal collection so much, and I've added all of these brands at some point, at least one from all of these brands to my personal collection in the past. So I'm going to be sharing with you this, and also I'm going to try and be as unbiased as possible. Sometimes when you see these tiers or these brand lists online, sometimes people maybe they just don't resonate, or a brand does not resonate with them, and so they rank the brand very low on their list, but they may be overlooking some redeeming or some actually very interesting qualities about the brand that would actually probably put them higher in the list if the person was being a little bit more objective instead of kind of just placing it in this catch-all category. So we're going to be covering it right now, but before we do that, on the wrist today I have a Rolex 1016 Frogfoot dial. I personally love this. I got this on this kind of autumn color strap here. Very beautiful vintage watch. And by the way, we are going to be covering some controversial brand placements, so trigger warning. And I've got my laptop right here, so let's get into it. We're going to start at the bottom, and this is going to be Emporio, Armani, and Bulova. Now, I know many of you out there are going to agree with the Emporio Armani, right? Fashion watch, pretty low quality, sometimes plastic watches, or made of something similar. But largely these are going to be not Swiss watches. These are not going to be watches that are made for enthusiasts like us. These are going to be watches that are fashion watches. They license the brand name, they put them on the watch. So whether it's Emporio Armani or, one of the other fashion labels out there, that's kind of where you're going to be finding these watches. Now, there are some exceptions. I've done videos on this in the past, so check out my channel where I talk about some fashion houses that do a really great job at producing watches, like Zegna, that had their watches produced by Girard-Perregaux, which is going to be very high up in our list. But overwhelmingly, the watch brands that use licensed names like this, Emporio Armani or Armani Exchange or something like that, are going to be very low quality. But with that, we have Bulova. Now, Bulova has some great history in terms of vintage watches. They were a serious competitor. They had a real place in the quality watch space decades and decades and decades ago. Now they're kind of trying to revitalize that with some of their watches, right? You see it with the Accutron line, for example, but largely they just haven't done it as of yet. I'm looking forward to see if they can kind of, reclaim some of what they had once upon a time, but it's very competitive. So that's all I'll say about Bulova, not trying to beat them up too much, but the reality is they do not really make a watch for enthusiasts, with the exception of the Accutron line, but largely they're making watches for the casual purchaser at something like a Macy's or a Dillard's. You get the idea. Moving on, the next tier up, now we have Bremont, Hamilton, Frank Mueller, Tissot, Tag Heuer, Baume & Mercier, and Jacob & Co. Now, some of these, I get it, you're probably not going to agree with, right? Bremont and Jacob & Co., as well as Frank Mueller, are in different price points compared to the others that I mentioned. But when we start talking about Bremont, it's a newer brand, but largely I just don't think that their prices are commensurate with the quality of watch that they're offering. They're offering micro-brand quality watches, which is not necessarily, I'm not trying to water down micro-brand in any way, but kind of the marketing and the feel that they give off for the brand is just not there with it in terms of the pricing. Now, I think Bremont's made some really great strides in recent times, last couple of years, but still brand recognition's not there. They've had much longer time than some of the new entrants to this category have taken, and the others have really just beat them entirely. Think of the Montos of the world. They're just blowing Bremont away. So Bremont does make this category, but I do want to also say that when we look at Hamilton, Tissot, Tag Heuer, Baume & Mercier. These are all good brands in their own regard. So while this is low on the list is very relative, right? We have to compare these brands up against F. Bijou, Patek Philippe, Rolex, Audemars Piguet, all of these other brands. So when looking at, relatively, they do rank lower, but they're still good brands for what they are. And that's something we need to consider, is it doesn't make them a bad brand. It just makes them perhaps not in the same category. Maybe it's missing some finishing details. So I don't want anyone to, kind of get disappointed that Hamilton's on the list, because reality, it still makes the list of good watch brands, right? So if you like one of these watches, do not let me hold you back. But surprisingly, we do have Franck Muller as well as Jacob & Co. at this tier, this lower tier, and I'll explain. Franck Muller has gone through many different hands in leadership over the years. They did have a real hot period where many celebrities were wearing them, maybe a decade, a little bit, maybe closer to 15 years ago at this point. And Franck Muller had a very interesting design, right? You have the Curve X and all of that kind of very interesting, quintessential, classic Franck Muller design, the crazy numbers, all of that. But the reality is they've just changed things up so much. They've come out with the new Vanguard line, tried to modernize, and they just haven't kept up with the market. They kind of got brushed aside in favor of more popular brands. The celebrities moved on to Rolex, AP, Patek, Richard Mille. So Franck Muller's at that list, and they sell at steep discounts in the gray market. I know, because that's what we do at Del Rey Watch. So the Franck Muller watches do make it pretty low on the list. Not saying they're bad quality, because once again, none of these in this category are necessarily bad quality. They just lost seriously the placement on the list over time. And that's for maybe another video where I'll elaborate on that. But as well, we have Jacob & Co. Now, Jacob & Co. does have some watches in their collection that are ultra high-end. What Jacob & Co. does is they have these very high-end pieces that they contract manufacture out to other watchmaking shops. Think of these more intricate, there's like an oil pump, and there's, these astrophysic type watches and these orbs that are really intricate, albeit delicate timekeeping machines. But the reality is they put those things out there and they get them on interesting people's wrists, and then they try to sell you on the more approachable lines that they have, and it works. But for me, it just can't go any higher on this list. They're just too ingrained in the marketing, and I think when we focus on the marketing, it starts becoming almost more fashion brand. This will be my one exception to the rule where I try to be objective. I'm sorry, I just cannot get behind Jacob & Co. watches. Leave your comments down below. Next, we have Bell & Ross, Roger Dubuis. I know Roger Dubuis should be higher, but I'll explain in a minute. We have Hublot, yes, Hublot, Longines, Casio, Bulgari, Oris, Breitling, Panerai, and IWC. Now, once again, some of these, let me explain. Bell & Ross, I think they make a pretty nice looking watch, and the quality is pretty good, right? I'm not going to put them up against Omega. I'm not going to put them up against Rolex, but in terms of the price points, a few $1,000s and under, they make a pretty cool watch. They have that classic military/aviator style watch that, it's okay. It's okay. I think it's in line with what's being offered from micro brands. So it's in the same line. Now, Roger Dubuis next to Bell & Ross, I get it. That's insane for many people, including myself, if we're considering the old Roger Dubuis, the Roger Dubuis, not the current day Roger Dubuis, which are these big, large, chunky cases, which are higher quality than Bell & Ross, but they really lost a lot of the respect from high-end watch collectors when they stopped doing what the original Roger Dubuis did, the very high finishing, and doing everything that they did that made the watches more sophisticated, interesting, special, and classic. They kind of went a little more mainstream, a little bit bigger, larger, chunkier cases. Still do a great job, but for what Bell & Ross lacks in quality, they make up for in terms of branding. They just do, maybe not in watch enthusiasts, but out there in the market, you see it in the advertisements, and they do sell, right? People like those square watches. Whereas with Roger Dubuis, they have a little bit substantially more in terms of quality to offer, but they've really lacked the branding for modern day Roger Dubuis out there. Let me know your comments down below. But as well, we have Hublot in this category, right? I'm putting Hublot next to Longines. The thing with Hublot is, I get it. Watch collectors like to rip on them. We like to say, haha, these chunky, funny watches that are not decorated as nice. I can't believe they're asking $15,000 for a $2,000 watch. I get that. but their target segment is not necessarily watch enthusiasts, right? These are going to be people that just want to spend money on a big chunky watch with that recognizability, and in certain places of the world, it's a recognizable brand. Now, I'm not saying that I would recommend necessarily buying a Hublot watch. You can if you love the watch, and I always recommend to buy what you do like. It's not the top of my list, but people that own them really like them. I've held them. They feel nice. If it fits your larger wrist, it could be a watch that you can get into, but it's not necessarily for enthusiasts, I would say. Think of where they started, on the wrists of celebrities. Others have moved into that space, so now we see them here. They've improved the quality, the finishing on the movements over time, but still, you could get a similar quality watch from Longines at a fraction of the price. And we have to throw Casio in this category as well, because it's not necessarily the quality here that I'm considering them for this tier. It's not just the quality of the watch. They have solid branding, and what they do at their price points, think of the G-Shocks, think of some of the other computer watches, the LCD or the LED watches, they are the best in what they do for that segment at the price point, right? So they have to be, there's a certain purpose or utility for a watch, and they kind of win in that category, so that's where they are. Now, someone may prefer the Roger Dubuis over the Casio, in which case, get the Roger Dubuis over the Casio. Just know that they're not going to be the same quality, but what they do in that category for what it is, they excel there, and that's why they kind of give and take and end up in the same category. And yes, we'll touch really quickly on Panerai. Some people like to rip on Panerai. I have in the past. I like the designs. I think Panerai hasn't done enough to innovate besides just put some interesting materials, recycled metals, things like that, and try to kind of keep up with trending things out there in the world in terms of going green and all of that. But something Panerai did do is they built out the Douai line, which many people didn't like, but they're actually pretty decent quality. I get it, the snapback cases, it's not classic Panerai. Well, guys, think about it like this, right? Like an auto manufacturer that produces, petroleum or fossil fuel burning vehicles comes out with an electric vehicle, and then someone criticizes them and say, how could you do this? Only Tesla can make electric cars. It's kind of the same thing. It's like, hey, why can't Panerai make a dressier watch? Oh, just because they never have. And that was kind of a lot of the criticisms. Now they've been caught up in their own issues over the year with not decorating movements and things along that line. But when they came out with the Panerai Douai, now recently they've renamed a smaller size, a 38 or 39 millimeter, to the Douai or the Piccolo, kind of with an integrated design. I think it's pretty cool. It shows that they're trying something, maybe not everything, but in terms of Richemont, Panerai might just not be their focus. They might just be very okay or complacent selling their certain number of pieces in that same Panerai styling for the person that just hasn't added a Panerai to their collection. I can go on and on all day, but next we have the next tier. This is going to be Cartier, Tudor, Mont Blanc. Yes, Mont Blanc, the pen maker, now watchmaker, well, for quite some time. But also we have Chopard, Jacques Drouot, Omega, Piaget, Richard Mille. I said it, Richard Mille is not at the top of the list. Zenith and Ulysse Nardin, UN. We have Cartier first. Now, Cartier has come a long way with their watches. They've come a long way since the Roadster. They've come a long way since they made watches that were considered cringeworthy for a while because just so many people had them on their wrist. Cartier is actually doing some pretty great things with manufacturer Cartier, and they're bringing back nostalgic watches. I think Cartier, even though they are an old world brand, they're gaining positioning in terms of their watch offerings. They've made some very high-end watches in the past, but they just don't focus on it. It's not their target market. It's not their tier, and they can charge a premium for their watches because of the Cartier name and the crossover between the other goods and jewelry. So Cartier makes that tier along with Mont Blanc. Now I'll say Mont Blanc has been producing some really great, dare I say, affordable watches, but for what they're offering, I would say affordable watches. Look at the Mont Blanc product catalog from recent times. They're offering some really great watches at price points that other brands would probably be charging double, triple, or quadruple, right? And when we had them in the door at Del Rey Watch, I was actually very surprised with the quality of the case construction, the movements. They're using the same type of movements as other manufacturers out there. You get it, base movements, maybe a little bit decorated and spruced up, but they do feel very nice on the wrist. The designs are very masculine, dare I say, for the most part. And so it's a very interesting kind of little thing. I would say almost a crossover between a Tudor and a Cartier, which are both in this segment because they also do produce some sportier models. But what do you think about Mont Blanc? Do you think they're going to be making a comeback or maybe just a back? I don't know if they ever went anywhere, if they ever really, did a whole lot. I mean, they had the Time Walker and things like that. But I think Mont Blanc is on the up and up. That's for sure. And I'll touch at this category. Yes, I'm putting Omega in the same category as Richard Mille. Now, many people like to look down at Richard Mille, but at the same time, many people like to look up to Richard Mille. They have high retail price points. Many influential, and I guess you'd say famous people are wearing the Richard Mille watches, and they've become very desirable, hard to get, sometimes selling several times the retail price, trading in the aftermarket, sometimes. Now, the thing with Richard Mille watches is, while the movements are sometimes lackluster, they do spend a lot of time and energy and focus and funding on the case construction of the watches. They're all about sporting, right? The whole Formula One thing, the tennis thing, that's what Richard Mille is. It's kind of funny seeing a guy playing tennis in $1 million watch, but they do it. And the reality is, some of the watches, they have to break several, if not more than several cases just to get the construction right. When you start working with really hard but light materials, creating that and molding it and engineering behind it can create a brittle construction process, and it can crack and ruin the case while they're manufacturing it. So there's been interesting stories floating around from Richard Mille saying, hey, we had to break 10 cases to make one. So that's factored in, but it's also sometimes just tedious. I'm sure they've perfected it at this point, or are coming close to it, what they can to perfect the case construction. But when you think about something like that, they're just going to be charging a premium, low production on the right wrists. It is what it is. Maybe they'll move aside for another brand to come out in the future and take their place. But when compared to something in the list like Omega is making a lot of big moves, but sometimes their watches sell at discount, so it's not one up on the list. The next category also has a couple that sell at discount, but Omega produces a lot of watches, and they distribute them all over the world, and in some places you can still get them 30, 35, dare I say 40% off the retail price, depending on the model. Not the black bezel, ceramic bezel, white wave dial Seamaster, which I know some people in the comments are going to say, I had to pay retail price. I get it, there's these outliers, but Omega is producing a very high quality watch in line with the others in this category, and some in the category higher, but they are not quite there in terms of branding, and they're not quite there in terms of retaining the secondhand value or the retail value of the purchase price of the watch. So that's why they don't make next on the list. Now, next tier up on the list, we're going to have Breguet, Vacheron, H. Moser, Girard-Perregaux, Grand Seiko, Jaeger-LeCoultre, JLC, Blancpain, and Rolex. Yes, there's one tier above Rolex, and many of you, once again, would have put Rolex next to Omega. I can get it. We're going to split hairs here for a second, as I explain. But something to keep in mind is this category I've kind of reserved for watch brands that have done something very special, such as Grand Seiko, or they're an old world brand that has extremely strong branding, has stayed very consistent throughout the years, and makes a very fine, high quality product. Now, some of this is going to be true for the top tier as well, the highest tier that I have. But when we talk about a Breguet, a Vacheron, JLC, Blancpain, these are all brands that are really focused on making very fine, high quality watches. They've produced sports watches as well as dress watches. They've had some variants. They haven't changed too many hands with the exception of Vacheron over the years, but they've kind of found their niche in classic watchmaking, and they've produced that, and they've had these watches on some of the wrists of the most notable people in the world as well as royalty, and that's just going to bump up the watch in terms of public perception, which includes the wrist, but also it's unlikely that you're going to see, watches being worn by, these essentially oligarchs and things like that are not going to be high quality. Yeah, sure, there'll be some outliers, but generally watches in this category are going to be coveted by people that covet the finest things. I mean, think of Blancpain, think of the Putins wearing the Blancpain watches, I believe the Blancpain Le Mans. Think of Breguet, royalty wearing this old school royalty. I mean, we're talking about a brand from the 1700s after all. And we put Moser and Grand Seiko in this category because Moser produces everything in-house. They make parts for other brands as well through their advanced research department or something along those lines. They're producing springs as well as other components. So they're really invested and focused on classic watchmaking with some modern twists. And the quality of the watches are there. I mean, some of their watches are much higher quality than others. The Pioneer, for example, is a much more approachable brand, but it also comes with a lower price point, and it comes in steel, which, the watch doesn't need to be as finely decorated as a watch that's going to be in precious metal on average, but that's generally how the industry is looking at it. A sports watch versus a dress watch. You don't need a sports watch to have every single thing polished and all the edges and the special finishing. You just don't need it, right? It's supposed to be a little more rough and tumble. But when you look at some of this, and then you have the Grand Seiko. Grand Seiko is here. Now, many people are going to say, oh, Grand Seiko belongs at the bottom of the list. It says Seiko in the name. Well, here's the thing with Grand Seiko. I get it. The branding, they're working on it. They may never be able to get it to where people don't associate them with Seiko. But Seiko is also moving up market, though. Let's not forget that. They're raising their prices, and they're producing some higher-end pieces, including the Prospects line, things like that. But Grand Seiko does some watches that are unbelievable. Everything from the Zaratsu finishing and the polishing on the case is held to a very high standard. And not only just a high standard, a very consistent standard. Sometimes brands can do things that are very nice, but occasionally they let a watch slip out the door that has a big issue. I haven't seen or heard or experienced any issues with Grand Seiko. Their Japanese lean manufacturing process is really exemplified in the watches they produce. The quality is there, and then that's not even considering their master workshop produced pieces, some of the fine rare gem set watches that they produce, the entirely handmade and hand finished watches that they do make and that do exist. And that's why they make this tier, is because they can do this. Now, is a $1,200 or a $1,500 quartz watch that Grand Seiko produces in an entry level going to be at this tier? No, absolutely not. But when we get into some of their higher end pieces, their master craftsman made pieces, that's why they belong in this tier, because when compared with something like a Rolex, which just has to be there at this tier in terms of notoriety, prestige, and just, if you think watch, think nice watch, you think Rolex. That has a value, right? That's like saying Kleenex, like I need tissue, well, Kleenex, right? That is what it's known for. So it makes it up there, and once again, they produce a very consistent product as well. Now, their highest end pieces are not going to match Grand Seiko's highest end pieces in terms of hand construction and finishing, because Rolex just doesn't do that. But what they do puts them at this tier in the list for so many reasons. Now, many of you out there, I want to see it in the comments below, because I know many of you are going to contest this, and I would just love to hear what you have to say. But Rolex is up there, guys. It really just is. I get it. You can't see the movements on most of them. You can't see the finishing, but that's not what they do. That's not what they excel at. They make a consistent product well, and maybe you can buy it, maybe you can't, but the reality is, in terms of quality, they are up on this list. And lastly, we have the highest tier, and I think most of these should be agreed upon. Some might say that Audemars Piguet doesn't quite belong here, but Holy Trinity, they've done some really high-end pieces, and they do have their advanced research that does make more intricate advanced pieces that put them in this category, and they're also very heavily invested into classic watchmaking and perpetuating a very strong brand into the future. So they make it along with A. Lange & FP Journe, and Patek Philippe. A. Lange & being a newer entrant to this category along with FP Journe. But the reality is, once again, they're making very high-end pieces, very finely decorated, very highly finished. Now, Patek Philippe, some people would argue, oh, they belong one step down because they use outdated movements, arguably outdated movements sometimes, or maybe they belong a step down because they just don't have availability. You name it, there's going to be someone that's going to say that. But what I would say is there's very few manufacturers out there that stand behind their products like Patek Philippe. And there's also very few manufacturers out there that polish the undersides of the screws. Patek Philippe, take apart a Patek Philippe. They polish the undersides of the screws. Most brands out there are not really paying attention to something like that. And that's also why FP Journe, a much younger brand than Patek Philippe, makes this list as well, because they care about the subtleties and the nuances. And when talking about luxury brands, that's kind of what it comes down to, is how great of a product can they make and what can they do that they didn't really have to, right? That's also why Grand Seiko made it higher on the list, because they don't need to do a lot of the things that they do in their high-end pieces to sell the watches, but they do it for what it is and to exemplify that they're masters of creating the watches. And that's kind of how I make this tier list, right? There's going to be some that might be splitting hairs. There's going to be some of these brands that maybe could belong in several categories, depending if the brand kind of transcends or their collections are in different price points, different segments. So overall, I kind of averaged this in my head and made this tier list for you as someone that's held and dealt thousands of watches and has experienced all of these watches from top to bottom. What do you guys think? Are there any other brands that I missed? I know I missed Zinn and some of the other smaller brands. I would love to hear it and see it in the comments below. Please do not forget to check out delraywatch.com and my Instagram, TheRealJohnP. Thanks, guys. You've been chatting with John P. Ciao.